Okay, welcome back to another episode of Livewire. I'm your host, Jared Moore, and remember, Livewire is the program where we take your questions from the chat. Today's program, we're going to have J.D. Colbert, who is a Mvskoke author. He has written numerous magazine articles. He also has worked in tribal government, and he has a lot of experience in Indian country. He has written a novel that came out in November of last year called Between Two Fires, The Creek Murders, and the Birth of the Oil Capital of the World. So there is a link if you want to purchase the novel in the description of this video, or if you just want to read a more detailed synopsis, you can click that link and go check it out while you're listening to our interview. But with that being said, thank you so much, Mr. Colbert, for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it, Jared. It's good to see you again.
Absolutely. It's good to see you too, sir. So I guess for me to start off with would be, could you give without giving out too much away about the novel, like what is a synopsis of this? Is this a historical novel? Is it historical fiction? Like give people an idea of what they're looking at.
Certainly. I call it a historical fiction thriller. And I would say approximately 90% of what I write about, both in terms of the characters and the events that are portrayed in my book, actually happen. I took a little editorial license to try to kind of keep the story moving at a pace that readers tend to enjoy. And fundamentally, Jared, I call it a history book without being a history book.
Right.
And so it's set in 1920s Tulsa. What we know as Mvskoke Creek people as Dalhousie, Old Town, and it centers on a grand conspiracy that emanates from the mayor of Tulsa's office, Mayor John Simmons, and a handful of his oil baron cronies to essentially legally steal lands in the Glen Pool, which in the 1920s was the largest reservoir of known oil in the world, and it ultimately produced some 500 million barrels of oil. And as you know, all of that land in and around the city today, Glenpool, the Glenpool oil field was all allotted Mvskoke Creek lands.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were a number of murders related to the legalized theft of that land. And of course, even beyond the murders, there was the theft of the oil-rich allotments. So that is the background of the story. On the other hand, I'd also like to say I have imparted to the narrative a kind of a love story between two natives.
Mm-hmm.
Sam Davis, the half-breed Creek protagonist, his female counterpart, Zitkala, who in real life was Lakota. In my book, I make her Lakota and Creek. And so they fall in love. They carry on kind of a passionate, tempestuous love relationship, while at the same time they're battling the mayor and his cronies to try to stop them from stealing, particularly one allotment in the Glenpool of Millie Naharkey, which I'm sure you've heard that name,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the things that happened to her. So. And at the very end, at the very center of the story, however, in the context of everything I just described, is Sam Davis, the Creek half-breed, who has severe identity issues. He is somewhat ashamed of his Creek heritage. He learned Creek as his first language. He still has the Creek inflections, and he's very conscious of that, particularly around white society. And his search for himself, he has a fundamental lie that he believes in, that if he just accumulates enough wealth, he'll be admitted into white society and he will find happiness.
Right.
Well, I put him through a series of trials and tribulations where he comes to question that fundamental lie that he believes in. So that is really at the heart of the story.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you see too, just generally in society, is that pattern. Some people, and during that time period, even,
yes, especially,
we're trying to get out of that, cage that society was putting them in. So
yes.
That's very interesting. So the novel, it takes place during just their romance, or is it like a generational thing? Like how?
The time period is probably some matter of months. I don't put a specific time period on it, but the events unfold in a matter of months.
Oh, great. So is this fictional character going to be like a recurring character? Are you planning a sequel, or where are we going with that?
Great question. Yes, I am planning a sequel. In fact, I've stuck my toe in the water, so to speak, on the next book, which the story, the history that I hope to convey is that of the Indian guardianship system and how that perpetuated the legalized theft of not just Mvskoke Creek lands, but especially for the big 5 tribes throughout the former Indian Territory.
Right.
Sam Davis will be in that story as well, but it'll be kind of the Sam Davis as a protagonist. His antagonist will be a headmaster at one of the boarding schools where not many people know this, but it's very common for these headmasters, when they became aware of an orphan who either had valuable lands or stood to inherit those lands, that they would literally auction off that child's name to oil barons,
yeah,
who would then legally steal their land.
Yeah, and that is an aspect that it's refreshing to see that somebody's doing like historical fiction that's calling attention to some of these things in a dramatic way, so that people can see really the impact. Because you can do just a historical retelling of all of the tragedies, but when you have a character that you can identify with and go on that journey, it really helps people to understand the impact of some of these things that happened. And the boarding schools were rife with techniques and ways for them to get at that land, especially just like what you mentioned after the discovery of the Glenpool. So you've got a sequel in the plan, and I want to tell the audience too, the reviews on Amazon for this are really good. So 5-star reviews, almost every one.
Wow. Yes.
So, and I don't know if, I'm sure you've been watching that, but so you should go check it out. It's not prohibitively expensive. You can get a hard copy. You can get it on Kindle if you have the Kindle subscription service, and it won't cost you a dime other than your subscription. So,
and the audio book is in production.
Oh, okay. Who do you have for the audiobook?
Myself.
All right, that'll work. So, have you been approached for any rights for any movies or anything like that?
Not yet, but I do have a connection, 3 degrees of separation, I would say, from movie producer Taylor Sheridan of Yellowstone fame. But that said, I am hoping it get in the right hands, because, and thank you for mentioning the very glowing and positive reviews. I'm very humbled by that. And I can report that virtually everybody who's read my book and have provided me feedback tell me essentially 2 things. One, it reads like you're watching a movie, very descriptive, very colorful. And then 2, this book needs to be made into a movie. So
right.
I hope that will happen at some point.
Yeah, and right now would be a great time for that to happen too, just because Native American stuff is kind of blowing up in pop culture right now, all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, with this book, was this something that you had to do a lot of research on? Did you have to go back and study stuff, or was it like you are? Because I know you've had a long experience with various tribal governments and everything. So, what was that process, the research process, like for you?
Great question. I would say I've relied on 4 primary sources. First 3 being kind of scholarship. And as you mentioned earlier, this history that is embedded in my book is a well-documented history. Probably most prominently, Dr. Angie DeBow in her book, As the Grass, the Grass Grows, and As Long as the Grass Grows, The Betrayal of the 5 Civilized Tribes. It came out in 1940. They just reprinted another edition, so no one can do this better than her. I knew I couldn't do that level of scholarship. Also, one of the female protagonists, Zitkala, the historic Zitkala, she came to Oklahoma under the guise of the Indian Rights Association, hearing all these stories, and she documented that in her report called Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians, in 1924.
Mm-hmm.
And then even earlier, the first real scholarship and documentation of this phenomena that happened was by Kate Bernard, who served as Oklahoma's first Commissioner of Charities and Corrections. In her reports to the Oklahoma legislature, 1908, 1909, 1910, she documented all this as well. So there's a common thread there going back all the way to 1908. But the fourth source is one I think is equally as valid, if not more so, which is as Mvskoke Creek people, our family stories and the information that was handed down to us by our elders. When I grew up, Jared, and I won't say exactly how old I am, but I came of age when the Beatles arrived in New York with Ed Sullivan. Well, coming of age in the mid-'60s, many of the Creek allottees I grew up in and around.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them would have been then in their 70s or their 80s. You know, some of them was as old as, say, 30 when they received their allotment, and these things happened to them.
Yeah.
So I heard this firsthand, and of course I committed it to a deep memory. And so I think it's true to say that this book is now almost 60 years in the making.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the main sources, and I think they've served me well in terms of telling this narrative. And again, to your point, not strictly as a nonfiction history book, because let's face it, only us history nerds really tend to read that.
Right.
And so I overtly was striving for a broader audience.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how do I tell this history in a way that will engage people in a broader context and bring this history to light?
Yeah, and it looks like it's working.
Yes, thankfully.
And I want to shout out to the audience too. If you have a question, pop it in the chat. We don't have any questions yet. Let's see. So, did you have any collaborators on the book? Is there anybody that you'd like to shout out in particular that maybe helped you? Maybe they didn't write any of it or anything, but they were like support network people. I always like to shout out to them anytime we're doing an interview, because there are a lot of people that don't ever get their name in lights or anything that are affiliated with it. So
yeah, no, and great question. In particular, as I wrote the book, each chapter, I shared it with what's known in the writing trade as beta readers. Mm-hmm. They comment about the flow, the pace of the story. Does it grab them? Does it engage them? And so two people in particular, one, Sandy Bach, a neighbor of mine just down the street. I live up in Tulsa. And then a friend from my days growing up in Claremore, and we also played on a football team together, Byron Harper, who lives up in Kansas City. They provided some really helpful insights as to the plot structure, the character development, character arc, all those kind of technical aspects of writing.
Right.
But mostly what I was looking for was how does this narrative impact you? What do you feel after reading a particular chapter? Right. So that was, I would say, invaluable to my writing process.
Awesome. So and it's on Amazon. So is this self-published, or what was the editorial process like for this? Because that's the other thing, is that's a lot of work to write it and then also do the editorial part. What was that like?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I like to say, Jared, this being my first novel, my first book, I didn't get the memo about a lot of aspects of this process.
Right.
I thought, for example, that writing the book was 90% of the heavy lifting. No, I would say maybe 40%. Like you said, there was a lot of editing, and at various levels. There's what's known as developmental editing, which is very high strategic. Does your plot make sense as a structure? Are the chapters appropriately in order, or do you switch them around? All the way down to copy editing, where you find grammar, punctuation mistakes. So there was that, and then there was such things as the book cover design. Fortunately, I found a website that people who do book covers,
you
can engage them. And my guy did a fabulous job.
Let me actually, while you're talking about it, I'm going to see if I can pop it up
Okay.
or just show it to the audience there.
Yeah,
Can
I
you
thought
guys get a look at that?
I gave my designer a general idea of here's what I'm looking for, and he took the ball and ran with it and did a superb job. And then you mentioned, I thought at the end of the day, I did go self-publishing through what's known as an imprint or a publishing house that basically is mine. I call Redbird Publishing, and
Cool.
in part because the two females in the book that play a very important role, and their native name translates as Redbird in both cases. So I kind of wanted to honor my creation of the characters in the book. And the other thing is, through a traditional publishing house, it takes a long time to bring a book to market.
Yeah.
It could be as long as 2 years.
Yeah.
And you give up a certain amount of editorial control over your work. And I didn't want to do that.
Well, and that's the thing too, it's important for the audience to realize this too, that because it's an aspect with Native American culture that is one of those wrinkles, that because there is going to be kind of like a non-native perspective inserted into the work when that happens. And that's something that's happened to Native Americans so much. Their story has been told by non-natives. And so it's like self-publishing is one of the ways that you can try to remove that from the process.
Yes.
And just like you mentioned, if you go to a publisher, of course, they're going to have some editorial say on it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So. And I feel to a certain degree that I am the voice of those original allottees. And so you're right, I didn't want that voice diminished by some editor that doesn't know any better, doesn't understand how what they want, what they're editorializing is the damage it's going to do to the narrative.
Exactly. Or worse still, to say, I want you to make these changes to the characters or whatever because this is going to serve a market, or and you're caught in that position where it's like, I've gotten this deal with these guys and maybe even gotten in advance, and now I'm kind of trapped.
Right.
I've signed something and I can't get out. It's kind of like almost you're learning lessons from situations that might have happened to your characters that are in the book. You're saying, I'm not going to get stuck in that same type of circular trap. So
exactly. And that's so true. Agents and publishers, their primary motive is, of course, financial. They want the more books they can sell, the better they do. And I get that part, but it does come at a cost. And I wanted to be true to my voice, my experience as a Mvskoke Creek person in telling this story.
Awesome. Well, I'm pretty much, is there any aspect of this that we haven't talked about that you think is important to mention to the audience? Because we are at about 20 minutes.
Okay.
Normally we run about 30. We can keep going, but I just don't see any questions in the chat. If you're watching the program, you got a question about this time period or this novel, pop it into the chat and we'll get it asked. But is there anything that we've missed?
Well, I would just add, I think one important point is embedded throughout the entire book are what I call pan-native experiences. Experiences, for example, as the forced allotment of the previous communally owned tribal lands, the Dawes Commission, the whole thing about being enrolled, not being enrolled. We know that's continues to be a big story for a lot of families. The tragic Indian boarding school experience, and of course the discovery of oil and other valuable minerals on Indian lands, and the subsequent legalized theft through the Indian guardianship system. So I think that's important for the listeners, the viewers, to know that all of those, again, I call them a pan-native experiences, are very strong themes throughout the book. The last thing I would say is one of the things I tried to do at a kind of a undertone, a latent voice of, for me as the author, of a kind of a mourning a lamentation for what the original Alatis went through, their experience, and the theft, the murders, and to a great degree, I think, a loss of a way of life that existed since time immemorial. So that sense of mourning, I hope to kind of pepper throughout the manuscript.
And how could you not have it? We have a question. Contact info for Mr. Colbert. Do you want to give out a phone number or anything? All right, go for it.
The easiest way is my website, jdcolbert.com. Readers can communicate with me through there. There's a little button you can push and send me an email, or leave your email address if you wish. That's probably the easiest way, jdcolbert.com.
And guys, I'll after this is over, I will put a link to that in the description of this video, so you can just click that link and go straight and get in touch with Mr. Colbert. Let's see. Well, I personally haven't read the book yet, but I'm going to read it now because Mr. Colbert is giving me a copy, which that's great. Anytime anybody out there wants to come on the show and give me a copy of their book or anything, I'll take it. So I'm going to read it, and then I look forward to the sequel. And I would say anybody out there that's watching the program that's in any position to contact Netflix, or you want to possibly start a movie production on this, go for it, because I'm sure it's going to be an awesome story, and the time period and the things that happened after the discovery of the Glen pool is just like rife for all manner of intrigue, you would say.
Yes, absolutely.
And with that being said, let me catch the audience up, because I know you guys, we haven't posted anything in a while, and the last thing that you guys saw was our Bad Press doc teaser for Sundance. And I told you guys I was going to Sundance and we were going to have all this content. Well, bad news is I got COVID, so I couldn't go. But I'm in the process right now with having Rebecca Lansbury and Joe Peeler, who are the co-directors on the project, back on the program on maybe this Friday to do the recap of everything that happened with Bad Press. And then we've got 2 more live wires that are scheduled for next week, and you guys will see them pop up, and I'll give you an update on Friday about those. So tune in for those. And with that being said, is there anything else that you'd like to add, Mr. Colbert?
No, I'm just very pleased and honored that you would have me on your show, Jerry.
Absolutely. Well, and I thank you so much for coming in and being on the show. One of our transitional periods from coming out of COVID is coming back into the studio and having people here, and you've been a delightful guest, and all of the information that's in your book, the factual stuff and the historical stuff, is a topic that needs to get out to more people. Non-natives, natives, everybody needs to know more about that time period in history. So.
Absolutely, and that's why I wrote it. And I will say, I, of course, expected this would resonate with the native audience. What's been a wonderful surprise is non-native audience, I think, has equally embraced it. So, like you said, the time is right.
Yeah.
To dig this history out from the closet and bring greater public awareness.
Awesome. So with that being said, we're going to sign off, guys, and we will see you guys hopefully later this week. If not, definitely next week. So Mado and Chihichathlis.